Hello, we are Larry Riggs and Sandra Hellier-Riggs, and the title of our presentation today is An Interdisciplinary Developmental Approach to Defining and Teaching for Critical Thinking. An explicit link between the issues of development and critical thinking is provided by Elder and Paul. In their stage theory of critical thinking, Elder and Paul argued that the first stage beyond unreflective thinking is that of the challenged thinker. The challenged thinker is one who has become aware of the actual role of thinking in life and of significant problems caused by unreflective thinking. This is in accord with our experience. History and contemporary society are saturated with and driven by thinking, much of which is developmentally immature and disastrous. Scriven and Paul made the crucial point that shoddy thinking is very costly. Our approach to fostering critical thinking deals with the issue of motivation to think critically by focusing on the costs of not doing so. We agree with McPeck that some course content areas are more suitable than others for fostering critical thinking. In the courses we will describe here, we are able to challenge students to think about issues which have significant impact in the social world. Our goal is to move students to recognize that they can and should become critical thinkers, and that recognizing meaningful challenges is the first developmental step. The first author teaches a general education course that is part of the core curriculum at a small private university. This course focuses on modernizing in contemporary Europe. In the author's version of the course, egocentric and sociocentric thinking are made explicit themes from the start. I try to move the students toward what Paul called critical thinking in the strong sense, toward thinking as and for moral agency. Paul emphasized seeing the negative consequences of uncritical thought in ethical terms. With this goal in mind, we look first of all at the role of thinking in the history of early modern and modern Europe. For example, beginning with Columbus and the Spaniards encountering the native inhabitants of Hispaniola, we look at the circumstances in which Europeans have found it morally convenient to define other groups as somehow less than human. This sociocentric tendency, which is not, of course, unique to Europeans, helps to explain how brilliant critical and moral thinking on the part of Europeans was often betrayed in practice. The ideas of human rights and of universal equality before the law are excellent examples of European Enlightenment thinking. However, other ideas, such as Darwinism, and some policies, such as imperialism, effectively impaired the realization of human rights and equality before the law. Clearly, the quality of thinking has had enormous impact in modern European history and in the histories of other peoples dominated and exploited by Europeans. The costs of uncritical thinking are clear. The culmination of this course, and the student's best opportunity to practice critical thinking, come at the end when we read T.R. Reid's The United States of Europe. Having looked at the European Union as Europe's attempt to overcome the consequences of centuries of sociocentric thinking, and to realize the promise inherent in Europe's best ideas, we read and evaluate Reid's argument that the EU is in many ways superior to the United States and destined to replace the U.S. as the world's moral and economic leader. Like a number of other scholars and commentators, Reid emphasized Europe's choice to develop and exercise soft power, as opposed to the hard military power possessed and exercised by the U.S. Reid also argued that the EU, by many measures, provides a better life for its citizens than does the U.S. Most students reflexively reject Reid's comparison and give ready-made reasons for doing so. They tend to repeat assertions that have long been in the air. The assertion that the U.S. has the best healthcare system in the world, for example. As their culminating assignment for the course, however, the students are challenged to write an essay, including a reflection section, in which they present and argue for criteria by which to judge societies, by which to identify the good, or at least a better, society, and then present evidence related to those criteria. Criteria such as life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, infant mortality, diversity, policies for supporting families, voter enfranchisement, gender equity, and others have typically been presented by students. Having chosen such criteria for judging the quality of societies, they are in a position to evaluate the wealth of relevant information that is available. Most students are surprised to find the U.S. well behind many EU members on indices that they have chosen as the most important. Both the choice of criteria and the search for information relevant to those criteria are key components of critical thinking. Moral agency is involved since the issue is defining the good society. The students have thought critically about the values that ought to dominate thinking about society and the problems that ought to be solved most urgently. In the process, they have gone far beyond reflexive defense of their own identity and interests. In fact, in some of their reflection paragraphs, they recognize that they ought to identify themselves as critical thinkers, not as members of any other kind of group. They have clearly gone beyond the unreflective stage and become, at the minimum, challenged thinkers.
I teach educational psychology courses at a large public institution. The content of the courses I teach seems pretty ideal for exploring ideas and sharing impressions. I feel like one key way to encourage students to think independently and critically is to create a safe place in the classroom to engage in critical self-reflection as students consider where their views and impressions may have originated. Students come to class with a lot of assumptions and opinions about concepts that I teach in my adolescent development course. One example of how I challenge students in this course to move from being unreflective thinkers to being challenged thinkers was to create an assignment in which they would learn new information that was incompatible with their current opinion. I asked students in my adolescent development class to select and bring to class their favorite item of clothing or another accessory such as a purse or a backpack. They showed the article to the class and said why it was their favorite. They gave the manufacturer's brand name and label. They stated why they chose it. The students also speculated about the target market or demographic at which the product or label was aimed. One way to help students move from the first stage of Elder and Paul's stage theory of critical thinking was to have them investigate the brand name and the parent corporation that produced the article they had chosen. They would have found as much information as they could with regard to the corporation's manufacturing practices and labor practices. For example, was child labor exploited in the manufacture of these goods? Students were also instructed to go to the International Labor Organization Child Labor website, which provided information about the problem of child labor and information about countries that still exploited children in the manufacturing process. Of course, students found that a lot of their favorite consumer items were manufactured in areas and by manufacturers which still exploit child labor. The students had to recognize that they were morally implicated in practices they abhorred and of which they had been completely unaware. They had been assuming that the only relevant issue in their choice as consumers was their own preference. In effect, this assumption prevented them from thinking at all about this morally significant aspect of their lives. Once students became aware of the extent of child labor practices, they began to realize there was a problem in their thinking or in their failure to think. As Elder and Paul pointed out, challenged thinkers, unlike unreflective thinkers, are becoming aware of how they think and of how the quality of thinking affects their lives. They reach awareness that critical, morally significant thinking requires them to reflect about their thinking, as well as about thinking in general. Students in this class began to recognize that their thinking might be flawed and flaws might be barriers to their development. They were forced to think about their inferences and assumptions based on the new information they had gathered. They realized that many countries still exploit children in many areas of manufacturing and that the marketers deliberately withhold significant information about their product. To further expand their thinking on this topic, I had students form groups of 4 to explore the possible ramifications of child labor practices and what they as an individual and what we as societies in general could do about it. The culmination of the assignment was to have them write a reflection paper describing the process by which their thinking was changed. Students' reflections described how they never considered the manufacturing of their favorite brand name clothing. They never thought about where it was made or by whom. Generally, they liked the design or style of the item, and really they never considered the rest. After learning about how many designers of clothing have their clothing manufactured in other countries where labor is cheap and often use child labor, students were adamant about learning more about child labor practices. Challenged thinkers, unlike unreflective thinkers, become aware of thinking as such and of the role of thinking in their lives. They realize that significant thinking requires reflection and active seeking of information. It's important for instructors to lead class discussions about the thinking process in general and to foster collectively thinking through a problem aloud. It's important for instructors to design classroom activities that require students to think about their thinking and to be encouraged to utilize their challenged thinking in other areas.